Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today a bit about the environmental history of Atlantic Canada, and specifically talking about the late Carboniferous forests of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, and what kind of things lived in this forest. This is going to be kind of like I'm going to kind of take you through time and give you kind of an overview of what this part of the world looked like 330 to 290 million years ago. So before I do that, a little bit about myself. So I'm a paleoecologist. So that means I study the ecology of different organisms from fossil record. I mostly work on looking at changes in ecosystems in response to climate change over long periods of time, and in response to the evolution of different animals over periods of time. So I got my start in British Columbia, where I grew up, working on ammonites before moving out to Lithuania to do a master's degree on the ecology of graptolites, which are like marine zooplankton. Since then, I've come out to Nova Scotia a couple times, started working at Carleton University to work on my PhD, where I work on the ecology of different late Carboniferous early amniotes and their relatives. And these animals, for the most part, come from Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, mostly out of Joggins here, and the Sydney coalfield in northern Cape Breton. So yeah, I work on these fossil ecosystems. So these are two images of trips I've taken in the last 2 months. On the left is myself and Jason Loxton, who's was professor out at Cape Breton University, walking the cliffs out in the Sydney coalfield. The right-hand side is, I think, from just a week ago. We were out on Prince Edward Island surveying or looking for fossil plants on the west. I believe this is from Imminagash on the west coast. Which is a very fun trip. I'm still kind of in field brain right now, so it's been really good. Yeah, so these are the different areas that kind of encompass most of the flora that I study in particular. So yeah, the west coast of Prince Edward Island, southern, so it's like southeastern New Brunswick, Joggins, obviously, and Cape Breton. So if I work on all this stuff, I should have a pretty good idea of what it looked like back then, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. So we're going to start in the middle Carboniferous, and this is represented best in parts of the Sydney coalfield and off at Joggins. This is about 330 million years ago, and this is roughly what the Earth looked like back then. And Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, are right here, just south of the equator. So this is very tropical environment. It's really warm, it's really wet, there's lots of oxygen in the atmosphere, and it's coastal. So all this material, all this land here would have been kind of going back and forth between being flooded by the ocean and being terrestrial. This is all coastal tropical landscapes. These tropical coal swamps have produced a lot of the coal that was mined out of here in the 19th and early 20th century, were full of life. And in particular, they were full of, these estuarine systems were full of different large arthropods, trees, but not trees the way we think of them now, and amphibians and early amniotes, which are egg-laying animals, tetrapods. And on top of the estuaries, there's also these riverine systems, so these different river systems that would come through and deposit material. So, and of course, because estuaries are different from rivers, you'll have slightly different ecosystems forming around them, which I will tell you about a little bit more as we go forward. The first of these kind of typical coal swamp genera, something we call a pitodendron, which is a lycophyte, a club moss Nowadays, you see them and they're quite small. They're none of them get more than about half a foot tall. They kind of creep along the ground. But 330 million years ago, these things were trees, like they were full-size trees. But because they're fairly basic in their vascular structure, they could only really like proliferate in estuarine systems and very, very wet systems where they could get a lot of moisture up into their leaves. And you can see in this reconstruction here, so they've got kind of very superficial root patterns, the little, like kind of shoot down, these are called stigmaria, these roots. They can't absorb a lot of water efficiently. So there needs to be a lot of water around for them to be able to grow to these immense heights. They also don't have leaves like we think of leaves. They've got more of these kind of bracts, these chlorophyllatic bracts that that kind of produce chlorophyll and allow them to absorb sunlight. But again, compared to the trees we have today, it's not as efficient. So they need to be able to get a lot of nutrients really easily in order to get to these kind of heights. Along with Lepidodendron, we also have Sigillaria, which is another lycophyte tree, a lycopsid tree. And in the same way, these are kind of covered in these bracts. These will get to similar heights, and they're very prolific in all of these middle Carboniferous estuarine and deltaic systems. Alongside the Sigillaria and Lepidodendron are Calamites, which is a giant horsetail. So just like the horsetails you have in like swamps around here, that these would have been massive, massive horsetails, and these were slightly better adapted to slightly drier systems. Still found in a lot of the very wet swamps, but also found kind of in more well-drained soils, places where water doesn't inundate everywhere. These will start to do a little bit better, and particularly in the middle Carboniferous, what this meant is that they were present in the very, very wet estuarine systems, but they were more dominant in these upland, well-drained environments. And you can find these fossils basically everywhere in the Carboniferous of Atlantic Canada. Alongside these plants were giant arthropods. This is probably the thing that most people remember the Carboniferous, apart from the big plants, it's what you remember the Carboniferous for is these enormous bugs, terrifyingly huge, Meganeras and eagle-sized dragonfly. That's very eye-catching. And Arthropleura is it's a millipede bigger than you, right? And we find tracks of Arthropleura in both the Sydney Coalfield and down in Joggins. So these are animals that would have been flitting about through these ancient forests alongside the giant arthropods. In the more marine systems are embolomeres, and I'm sorry, that map in the bottom right is false. Ignore that map. But these embolomeres, they're relatives. They're not quite amphibians, but they're relatives of early tetrapods, kind of along the evolution of early land animals with 4 legs. And these were really well adapted to kind of these semi-aquatic lifestyles, kind of similar to how you'd expect a crocodile to live today. And so in more estuarine systems, places with a lot of water in them, these would have been very, very skilled top predators. Alongside the embolomeres were amphibians and microsaurs, things like Andersonoperton, which comes from here in Joggins, and Dendriperton, which also comes from here in Joggins. And Dendriperton is a temnospondyl amphibian, and Sonorpaton is a histopod amphibian, so it's or a microsaur. We're not sure exactly where it falls in the lineage, but it's legless, which is really cool because it's kind of this early adaptation towards the same things that we see legless lizards and snakes do hundreds of millions of years later. And Dendropaton, which is famous for being found inside the stumps of these ancient trees. The most famous thing to come out of this period, though, is an early amniote called Hylonomus. And this is particularly famous because it being the earliest amniote we know of, means it's a relative of our ancestors and the ancestors of all mammals and reptiles, birds. Would have the beginnings of that lineage would have looked something like Hylonomus, an animal which was found at Joggins in the Middle Carboniferous of Nova Scotia, living in exactly these systems, moving around between the trees in these wet tropical forests, swamps. So this is where Joggins comes in. Joggins is a particularly amazing site here because it spans such a long period of time that we get to see the kind of transition between different ecological systems, and you get to see all the different ecosystems that are present over tens of millions of years as you go down the coast of the Bay of Fundy. And of course, the most famous here are these giant stumps that are found still erect in the section that preserve all sorts of critters inside them. In particular, Dendropaton, which was named Dendropaton tree lizard, tree critter, crawly thing. I don't quite remember what erpaton means off the top of my head, but they found it inside a tree, so they named it after finding it inside the tree. So moving forward, once you get out of the Middle Carboniferous, the continents of Euramerica and Gondwana, these two large paleocontinents, began to converge, and as they converged, they formed what you're probably aware of as Pangaea, this massive supercontinent, which would have formed in the late Carboniferous as these two continents collided, forming these massive mountain range that became the Appalachian mountain range today, but of course, much taller back then. The planet was also going through different glacial cycles at the time, so you have the formation of large ice sheets at the South Pole. So glacial cycles, of course, come and go. They vary over time, but what this means for our biomes is that during the heights of glacial systems, it's drier, and especially near the equator, it's drier. So these lycopod forests, these sigillarian forests, will recede in favor of forests dominated by species that are better adapted to drier environments. Now, when I say drier environments, this isn't a desert. We're not talking about like really, really dry environments. A lot of the time, these are still swamps. They're just swamps with slightly less water in them. But for the purposes of the evolution of plants, this relative drying is really significant, and a lot of that is facilitated by the onset of glaciation in the late Carboniferous. So you go, another thing that happens, of course, is when these two continents collide, the formation of a large supercontinent leaves a lot of inland regions with not a lot of with not nearly as much precipitation as they would have had. And so you go from tropical wetland biomes to tropical dryland biomes with fewer sources of fresh water available for the trees. This shift, particularly in Western Europe, and Eastern North America led to a shift in the composition of the plant communities in this part of the world. And particularly, you go from these lycopsid forests, these giant lycophyte trees, into more conifer-dominated and tree fern-dominated forests, which I will kind of show you later, as these ferns and conifers were better adapted to drier environments than the lycopsids that came before them. So we go into the late Carboniferous. This is about 305 million years ago, and this is represented a little bit in Joggins, which is not shown here, but all primarily in the Sydney coalfield and the west coast of Prince Edward Island. So here you can see we went from Atlantic Canada being kind of coastal in this tropical coastal kind of mangrove swamp type scenario to basically in the middle of a continent. And it's much drier now, much drier. It's harder to get water to you when you're not immediately adjacent to the ocean, but of course still tropical, still very warm. And these are mixed forests. So a lot of these forests will you still find lycopsids, but they're not nearly as common. And you'll start to find and you'll still find your calamites, your giant horsetails, but again, reducing in abundance in favor of early gymnosperms. So these are the early conifers, relatives of pines and firs now, called chordaides. And chordaides is this, and these we get these massive trees that look superficially a bit like a modern mangrove or even like a palm. But of course, they're nothing like that in terms of relation. But these are very, very, very tall trees that are still adapted to living near water, but are much better adapted to times of drought than lycopsids and even calamites would have been. And these could get massive. That chordaides on the left, it's hard to see because you don't have anybody in the picture for scale, but that would have on its side right there, that's going up to about my hips. This is a very, very large tree. Alongside these chordaides, treed ferns and seed ferns. Now, tree ferns and seed ferns were around in the middle Carboniferous, but they get quite large and they diversify a lot in the latter part of the Carboniferous, and in particular what we call seed ferns, or they look like ferns, but they are not ferns. These are basically relatives of early gymnosperms, of early seed-bearing plants that look like a fern but bear seeds instead of spores. So they've already evolved the ability to have a seed, which is much more capable of dispersal and growth in a dry environment than a spore would be, which typically needs to be facilitated by some sort of at least partially waterborne section of its life cycle. These things look gorgeous. This is very now you're starting to look, you're getting forests to start to look very tropical and like what we would think of as like a tropical dryland forest. These big ferns, large conifers. Of course, there's no flowering plants. You got to wait another 200 million years for that. But you're starting to get these big kind of leafy organisms dominating your forest landscape. Alongside the tree ferns and the seed ferns is the diversification of amniotes. So that little Hylonomus I showed you from Joggins before, well, some of its relatives have started to get pretty wild with what they're trying to do in terms of different evolutionary strategies. So from the Sydney coalfield, you have animals like Paleothyrus, which is an early synapsid, a relative of us a long way back, a relative of early mammals, and also relative of things like Dimetrodon, which will come later. And it has adaptations, we think, that are built more for hypercarnivory than eating bugs and fish. On top of that, you have a Dendromaya, a Varanopid, so another different kind of early amniote, which was actually described by my supervisor, Hilary Madden, and has evidence of parental care in these early amniotes. So there are different ecological strategies already evolving this far back, 305 million years ago. On top of that, you also have Erpetonyx, which is an early parareptile, and that's also one of the earliest amniotes found on Prince Edward Island, showing the diversification across the entirety of Atlantic Canada. So these dry environments required specific adaptations, and this might be a little dry for you, but I'd like to kind of talk about why these different plants we're seeing over time are, why they're better adapted to different environments. So Lepidodendron, you can see these are the cross sections of its stems and roots, and you can see they're very, there's only a couple different kinds of cells. They're very bunch of it, they're small. This is not particularly efficient for moving water through. There's not a lot of different jobs for the different cells to do. You're basically, the cells are either there to move water up slowly or to just keep the tree standing. When you get into slightly more vascularly advanced, or complex plants, you get into things like Calamites, these early horsetails. They get to more differentiation of the vascularization, and particularly have this central nutrient-bearing and then these vessels carrying water up on the outsides, which are much more conducive for what we call capillary movement, or like, it's like a pneumatic tube, basically pulling water up through the tree. And by the time you get to conifers like chordates, that looks, for all intents and purposes, a lot like what a normal tree that we would think of looks like. So there's differentiation between xylem and phloem, these different nutrient and water-bearing vessel structures that are capable of moving lots of nutrients and lots of water up through the tree quite efficiently and rapidly, and distributing that to complex leaf structures at the top. When we get into the early Permian, it's bright here now. When we get into the early Permian, Pangea has really started to glom itself together, and this part of the world anyway started to move a little bit north of the equator. Now it's still tropical, but it's moved slightly from where we were in the middle of the Carboniferous. Again, this is where we are now. This is represented in Atlantic Canada, specifically in northern and southeastern Prince Edward Island. These are less well-studied regions. Part of the reason I've done my fieldwork out there recently. These are less well-studied regions than the rest of Nova Scotia, partially, than the rest of Atlantic Canada, partially because preservation in these areas is, instead of being these kind of silty shales like you get in large parts of the Sydney coalfield and Joggins, it's sandstone. Sandstone doesn't preserve anything nearly as well as shale does, but in particular, leafy structures, very thin carbonaceous structures, are much worse preserved in sandstone than they would be in shales. And as a result, you don't get quite as much. Now, the reason these are sandstones is because a lot of these are very terrestrial environments. This material is being deposited primarily by rivers in deltas or in river valleys. But because of these drier inland systems, you get even more diversification in early conifers and plants like Tilodendron and Walkia, which you can find out on the coasts of Prince Edward Island. And these are very well adapted to dryland environments and act a lot like how we consider not modern conifers to act. They have seed-bearing cones. They proliferate their pollen primarily by dispersing it through the air, and they are able to withstand long periods of drought because of their very efficient vascularization. Alongside these conifers, the last thing I'm going to talk to you about are more developed synapses, and the most famous thing to come out of Prince Edward Island is Dimetrodon, which is, I think you probably know what Dimetrodon is. This large sail-backed synapse, this massive hypercarnivore, part of which was found on northern Prince Edward Island. So these systems would have been able to support the complex enough ecosystems that a massive hyperpredator like Dimetrodon would have been able to survive and proliferate, with the support with support of these basic primary producing plants. So thank you for listening. I know that was a lot of time to get through. We moved through about 30 million years in just over 30 minutes, but I hope you feel like you have a good idea of what the world looked like back then and how these different forests evolved. I'd like to thank Joggins Fossil Institute for hosting me here, and Carleton University for letting me come out here and do this talk and do all my field work here. So if you have any questions, now will be the time.